This is Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash, a podcast about everything that happens after Git Push. Ship It is brought to you by Fly.io, the home of changelog.com. Launch your apps close to your users all around the world. Learn how at Fly.io.
Hello and welcome to Ship It, the podcast all about everything that happens after you git push and when code becomes software. I am your host, Justin Garrison, and with me as always is Autumn Nash. How's it going, Autumn?
It is Sunday and I have lots of coffee, so very well.
You have lots of, how's that different than a normal day?
Because on Sundays I do fun nerd work and not like corporate
Not
America
nerd work.
It means that I have so much more time to do all the... No, you're right. It's the same thing. We're parents.
Okay, I'm just making sure. I'm not throwing shade. This is...
I thought about it and I was like, you're doing the same stuff you do during the... Damn it, Justin, don't ruin this for me.
It's okay. You can like Sunday. It's fine. I'm not trying to throw shade on.
I was like, I have coffee and I get to do fun nerd things. And I was like, wait, my fun nerd things are a lot like my corporate America nerd things and parenting. Dude, my kid had his first soccer game yesterday and it was a bunch of 3 and 4 year olds just like running around with soccer balls. It was the cutest hot mess ever.
We use game in a loose term there. It's like,
dude, the dads take it so seriously. Like I spent half the time making fun of them. I was like, the kids are cute and all of the dads need to calm down. Like they were so into it. I was like, they're 4. Relax.
Watching my kids play sports, the one thing I realized is like, it doesn't matter. Like, it is cool to see someone at like the top tier athleticism or whatever. But like, if competition is equal, or even if they're just having fun, like it's still fun to watch. Like, it's just like, I'll just go. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a pro athlete or not. It's cool.
Dude, 3 and 4 year olds are hilarious. Like they are like the end of the good things in the world. Okay. Like they don't know enough to try to act cool. Like everything is just like, it's like squirrel. Like
yep.
It's great.
There's no pressure except for just to live in the moment.
Yes.
And it's like, it's just, hey, guess what? Like taxes are coming for you, kid.
And they think everything is hilarious and they have like the best jokes and they say the most ridiculous things. They're like my favorite.
So that's what's going on in our lives today. And we are recording on a Sunday, but this episode is for Rich Burrows. And Rich is a friend who I invited on because he has a wealth of old history, lore, and knowledge about how things used to happen on the internet. And this episode is all about how he used to ship WebMD.com.
Rich is also super cool and has the best classes.
Yes, he is a really cool guy just in general and has great glasses. His beard is amazing.
Before beards were cool, Rich had beard. Like, oh, and not just that, but like his like blue sky like in tweets are off fire. Like and he makes infrastructure cool.
Yeah, so we had a great conversation with Rich. We hope you enjoy it too. It's just fun. Again, this is one of our retro things of just like looking back on how things used to work, and there wasn't all this complexity in things that we do now. And maybe it was a simpler time. Maybe there was less money involved and risked, but also maybe we look back on it as more nostalgia than we might today.
I love that he was just like he got into it because he thought it was cool, and then his like interest in it landed him into like a job. And the fact that just all his stories are like, you had how many boxes and you ran a whole website. Like, it was insanity. I was like, how did everything not die?
And the secret is it always was dying, but people prop it up.
Basically.
So to start the show today, like always, we have some links of the week. And my link is from theverge.com and it's called The Cloud Under the Sea.
Ooh.
I loved this article because it was more of a visual experience than an article. It's a very long article. It is extremely long, but the design on the page is so great. Like it's just more of a interactive magazine, which I know The Verge does quite a few of these like long expose pieces.
I love interactive like I think it's so much fun.
Yeah, but just in general, like the visuals in it were really good. This is actually something that I wish was like a documentary because I would have loved to see more visuals around it. I know it's kind of hard to show fiber lines under the ocean in a video, but just what you're dealing with on ships. And so The Cloud Under the Sea, a great piece just about how a lot of the infrastructure that connects data centers and countries together is really just these small garden hoses under the sea, and where they go and how people repair them, specifically how the ships kind of repair them and work. There's also a book called Pipes, which is another great book about this same network in book form, and it does a lot of like how a data center connects to a different data center. Like they walk the whole path, which is fun because they have like when it comes up on a beach, like what do you do? Like what, how do you actually like terminate that and then like make it go somewhere? Like do you connect it like in the ocean water right there? It's kind of shallow. Like what do you do? So that's the book is also really good. But for the link, I'll go with The Cloud Under the Sea.
I like to read stuff like that to my kids because I think the magic in the world is learning that these invisible things are things that you take for granted. So much work goes into it. Like I used to love that show. What was it called? How Things Work as a kid, you know, and just like learning the secrets. And I think it gives you more appreciation for different people and different jobs. Also, speaking of different appreciation for different people and different jobs, you can tell that a designer and other people had input on this because it's visually beautiful. And the visuals really drive the points home in the article. So not only is it like technologically interesting, but it's very like visually like puts the dots together and also is just, I don't know. I think it makes it richer. The experience is richer. And a lot of times like visual arts and designers are always like, well, we can get rid of them. But it's crazy how much it adds to the experience, you know?
And this is one of the pieces that like I love reading on my iPad, but usually it's just like text. And this was like one of those like it felt like what reading on an iPad should be.
The whole intro part is just like, oh, what's gonna come next? You know, like and it's so pretty.
As you scroll, like things happen with the scrolling and like things come into view. And it's all of that was a lot better than reading it on my computer or even on my phone, because it'd be too small on my phone. Like it was like this perfect moment of like I read that whole thing on my couch on my iPad. I'm like, oh, this is great. Like this is close to a novel. And I already knew a lot of the like technology behind it. And again, reading the books and seeing other things, but it was still fun just how they followed these people, you know, that were on the ships doing repairs.
See, I have too much ADHD for like TV because I have to stop and start things a million times as a mom, and it gets so frustrating that like the stopping and starting and stopping and starting, right? You know, remember we were talking about on TikTok about how many times you have to get up when you have children?
That's what I was gonna say. I was like,
and you were saying this would be a great documentary, but for me, like the fact that I can get that visual experience and put it down and pick it up in between making my kids macaroni and cheese, like, you know, sometimes those are the only like really visual, like cool experiences I get because it's like you're running around from work and soccer and this and that. So I am so here for it. Like I really appreciate all the effort that, you know, the little details that people put into to make that cool and visually stimulating. So the UK introduces its first IoT security laws. This is IoT Tech News. I thought this was interesting because the fact that technology has advanced so much in the last few years, or just overall the last century or so, our laws have not caught up to it. And I don't know if our lawmakers make or understand enough about technology to make laws for it. Like, did you see Nancy Pelosi and all the other people talking about algorithms like not too long ago about TikTok? And we're like, she has no idea what an algorithm is. You know what I mean? And it's crazy that this is such a big deal to do IoT security, and it's the first law, but it's really, really simple things that you would think that, you know, you wouldn't have to tell people, but we all know those are the things you have to tell people because usually the biggest security hassles are something that they just walked in the front door because people didn't make good enough passwords. So it's interesting that some of them are like, just don't have easy to guess passwords. Don't use 123, like, but that had to be a law because people will do it, you know? And the other ones are like, publish vulnerability disclosures, state minimum periods for providing secure updates, and provide mechanisms for securely updated software. But what I found interesting is the password section of it came from the Mariah botnet incident, which is a DOS attack that was like super, I guess, infamous, but I just thought it was cool because I love the Georgia Tech write-up that was done about it. So it's just crazy to see like people go and write these great postmortems and to see actual change in laws come from them.
of those bullet points in the article too, like publish vulnerability disclosure policies for reporting security flaws. Like that's not, they don't have to do anything. They just have to like have a blog post and say, hey, by the way, this is vulnerable. And like the second one, state minimum periods for providing security updates. Is again, they don't have to do anything. They just have to say, we are going to have 12 months of security vulnerabilities or something. And then that last one on there is provide mechanism for securely updating software. Like that's the first one that like, oh, they have to have a way to update it, right? Like just like, you just have to, this is the thing that's wrong. This is our guarantee for this thing. I wonder how this applies to things that happen. Like I know California is pushing out a really big law for right to repair and right to be able to own some of the hardware and stuff and like be able to fix it and be able to, hey, if this is vulnerable, I should have a way that I can get into it. Even if you don't provide security updates, I should be able to push in my own security updates if that is something that is outside of your cycle of maintenance anymore. And so I'm wondering how this kind of plays into that as well, where it's like, hey, on one hand, they need to be responsible for some amount of time. And then beyond that, a consumer or someone smart enough or a community should be able to take over and provide the other security updates and things. Because I have plenty of IoT devices that are long past their life cycle, but I've been able to flash them with different firmware or close them off from the internet and do things that I have some control over, but not necessarily like root them, and not all of them, at least. I can't take full control. So
I remember when I first had my kids, and it was the baby monitors that you could kind of set up on your own network got really popular. And even the ones that you couldn't, people were driving through with the remote ones and connecting to people's baby monitors. And it got to a point where there was one article, I think, where people were talking to people's children.
When they had the two-way, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just like, guys, you cannot just set it up with the default password. Like I had to tell like whole mom groups like to stop doing that.
Well, like the 900 megahertz, like they was completely unencrypted in the clear. And if you had like a way to pick up that, like you could just use an SDR, software defined radio, and pick it up and just like, oh, I can send information to this same channel. And
dude, I have cameras like still in my garage in the boxes, and they were a bunch of like nanny cams. And I was like, this is great. They're super cheap. Why are they super cheap? And I got them, and they like, it was like cry detection software, but it's also a bunch of spyware on them. And I got like halfway through the setup and I was like, nope. Like, it's like hard pass.
I've been wanting to do this series on YouTube or TikTok about just reading the open source licenses in some of these products. Just like going to the manual, because I literally, being me, I'm sitting in my car waiting for my kids for school and I'm browsing through the licenses that are in my infotainment system. It's just like, it was there. And I was like, oh, what software's in here? And I'm like, oh, there's like 18 different Android pieces of, oh, look at this SSH. I'm like, wait, I know that version of SSH that had a bug, right? And so like, I'm looking at because it has the versions, the dates, the license and everything else in it. I'm like, someone should expose, like not expose it, but just like talk about it. Like this exists in everything.
I want y'all to know these are the gems of being friends with Justin. When you get a random text and he's like, did you know this is in there? And I'm like, no, tell me more.
Random screenshot. Yeah. What is this doing in my refrigerator?
No, but like, dude, I got some warnings about updates that came over my refrigerator, and I was like, and now that's like a record feature, and I was like, whoa, I didn't ask for this. Like, like I wanted a Twitter feed with a screen on it, and Alexa, now you're getting too deep. We're too deep now. Like, I was like, oh my God, I'm turning into one of those people in tech who's like, let's take all this stuff out of, like, I don't want any more smart home stuff. I was like, I'm becoming one of those old salty tech people. I didn't know I was going to get here. Like,
I'm at the point where I still want them for the convenient side of it, but I don't want them connected to anything. Like I want to own both ends of that. Like
I remember when I first got into like to tech, like seriously, and like everybody was like, I don't have any Alexas. And I'm like, how can you not? Like I was obsessed with IoT and smart homes and the, like all of the lights and stuff. And now I'm like, oh, we've got to find a happy medium. Like, because they just keep updating more and more stuff and just sending you stuff without even really getting like telling you what these updates are doing. And you're like, whoa.
My youngest child's first word was Google. Like literally, because we used to say, okay, Google all the time. Oh, sorry. I just triggered my own for music and whatnot. It was just like, and then that was
it's wild. Between my first kid talking to Alexa and my third kid, the way that Alexa understands voices is like a game changer. And then like just the fact, like it's part of their life, you know?
Yeah.
Like they grow up talking to Alexa. And like, can you imagine if we grew up like little us's would have been like, you did what? Like it's amazing. Yeah, like brain melting. Like, so it's crazy. Like the way that kids can use an iPad, the way that kids can use like Alexas, like it is built into, like when we were talking to Mandy, I was thinking like that was one of my first like hardcore exposures to the internet. Like you could talk to like all the little nerds that had the same interests as you, that
they all got an AOL CD from the grocery store.
That's what I'm saying.
Put it in for their 90 minutes free. And
like my son is going to robotics camp, but he's going to build like those battle robots, and I'm like, this is where he finds his people. You know what I mean? And I remember like being that kid and like being the nerdy kid, and then you find like people that are into art and like technology and these things that you're into. And that was like one of my first exposure into like, you know, finding kind of like my group of people. And it's crazy. Like as adults, we still use Twitter or Blue Sky or, you know, and it's kind of like they were exposed from it from day one. Like it's insanity.
So speaking about back in the day, let's jump into our interview with Rich and all about how WebMD used to work.
What's up, friends? I'm here in the breaks with Salma Alam Naylor from Sentry, Senior Developer Advocate. Let's talk about the levels of error monitoring. So let's talk about error monitoring with medium to large-ish teams. And I don't even know how to quantify that necessarily to say maybe it's a team of 5 or 8. Maybe that's a medium team. Maybe medium to largest is like 20 plus, 50 plus engineers. You got multiple teams, you got multiple services, you got multiple disciplines within the engineer organization. How does Sentry go from indie dev, solo application developer, or a small team to scaling to support larger to mid-sized teams? What changes?
So it's interesting that you mentioned microservices. And often these days, when you have larger teams or you have multiple teams in an organization working on a product, you will have your application split out into little projects, different repos, microservices. And sometimes it can be difficult to know where an error is coming from. For example, if you just send all your errors to one place. And sometimes it might be difficult to know where the error started and where the error finished up. But what's really good with Sentry is that we have this concept called tracing. With Sentry tracing, you essentially connect your back and front ends together. If you want to know the details about it, it's through an HTTP header. And that's how Sentry will trace your requests from one service to the next, from the back end to the front end. And so in the Sentry app itself, you can physically trace what happened from where the request originated on the front end, then all the different services that the request passes through to, and then back to the front end, and then be able to identify exactly where the problem happened and exactly what in the front end triggered it or what in the back end triggered it. You can view the source codes and the stack traces all related to it. And then what you can do is, based on where the error came from, you can then automatically assign those issues to particular members of particular teams using things like maybe custom tags or other kind of identifiers on the issue itself. And so it helps you triage, like Sentry gives you that separation, yet also brings it all together to help you understand the bigger picture, the smaller things about what went wrong in like a fine-grained way, and then allows you to configure the app itself to perform particular actions depending on what happened. You know, like a lot of the time, large teams can actually get inundated with a lot of noise. I remember working for a company where we had 2 teams, a back end and a front end team, but everyone was getting every single error from everywhere. And so what happens eventually is you ignore all of the errors. Oh, it's failing as expected. It's just noise. It's getting in the way of my day-to-day coding. But if you are more selective about the types of alerts that you send and that you receive as someone who's doing a particular job, you'll be less likely to ignore them, more likely to address the root cause. And then eventually you will have no alerts and no bugs, and your application will be perfect.
Okay, get Sentry, go fix it. Too easy. Check them out at sentry.io. That's sentry.io. And make sure you use our code changelog and you'll get $100 off the team plan, which is super awesome. Again, use the code changelog, get $100 off the team plan, Sentry.io.
All right. Thank you so much, Rich Burrows, for being on the show today. I am super excited to talk about this. Rich, you've been around technology for a little while and you've been doing a lot of stuff.
A little while.
Because when we reached out, like, this is one of our retro episodes, and I'm really excited to talk about what you used to do with technology. So tell us what you did, what you were doing, I don't know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago? When was this?
I mean, I started off in the mid 90s.
How did you get started?
It's kind of a funny story. So I had a friend. I didn't have a computer at the time. This was like early 90s. And I had a friend who had a Mac 2E or something like that. And he would connect to a local ISP through dial-up. And at that point, there wasn't even pictures, right? It was just all like text-based stuff. And he was playing a MUD, which, if you're not familiar with those, they're a text-based game like Zork or something like that, but multi-user, right? He was playing one of those, and I got kind of addicted to it. And I finally got a computer and was playing it. But sometimes the ISP server would get laggy. I was dialed into like some old Sun server. And I heard about this thing called Linux that was pretty new, where you could actually run it on your own computer and then run the client on that. And so like the lag wouldn't be as big of a deal. And that was how I got into Linux. And I was involved with that for a few years. It's kind of funny because back then, like, being a sysadmin was like a dream job for me, right? Like, because there just weren't many of them. To be a sysadmin, you probably were at a big company, or especially at a university, to be at a place that had internet access. And I kind of ended up falling into it sort of backwards. I got a job as just a tech support person at an ISP. We were doing things like changing people's modem and NIT strings and stuff like that, just helping them with connection issues. And after a while, they just realized that I knew like a lot more about Linux than they thought, because I'd been just playing around with it so much. And that was the very early days of Red Hat. And I was using Red Hat, which is what they used. And like, my boss knew more about Unix in general than I did, but I knew more about Red Hat. And so I would be like, showing him stuff about RPM and things like that. And so finally I got promoted to be a sysadmin. And that was where I started. That was probably like 96.
That's awesome that you got like your dream job.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny looking back on it because I would never take that job today. But like back then I just thought that sysadmins were just the coolest, right?
I was talking to my friend about that. Isn't it crazy? You get like this dream and you're like, I want this job or this like thing. And then you get it and your dreams change over time, like.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And things were so different back then, at the ISP that I was at, I think that when I showed up at first, we had like maybe 5 servers, and there was like no load balancing or anything, right? They were just like these individual servers like sitting on the network.
And you were web scale, right? Like,
yeah.
for what the web was at the time, like that's all you needed.
Yeah, for sure. We didn't have a firewall.
There was no firewall, no such thing, right? Like Windows, whatever, that was 98 or something like that. Like no firewalls until like XP Service Pack 2 had a firewall. Like it was just like, yeah, you just open ports all the time.
Yeah. So when I showed up, there was no sysadmin, and there hadn't been for a while because my boss had fired the last sysadmin. When I say my boss, he was the owner of the company, because the previous sysadmin apparently would do this thing where he would say that he had stayed up all night doing maintenance, but he was just like playing Duke Nukem or something, right? they came in and he was like asleep at his desk with like the game still up. So they fired him, and like there was months where they didn't have anybody like patching the servers and stuff like that. And one day I'm talking to my boss and he says, oh yeah, I'm looking on our mail server and somebody's FTPing off the password file. And this is, for those of you who know about password files in Unix, this is like the very early days where the passwords weren't even hashed yet.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was literally the plain text passwords in the file. And this guy is downloading them all.
Oh no.
No shadow, no salt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I was like, man, you got to let me like do some stuff. And, ended up like you could do shadow passwords. It just wasn't the default,
Right.
So I ended up doing that. And I ended up doing the Linux firewalling and that thing called the TCP wrappers, where you could also restrict like what could connect to what. And I nerded out on security stuff for, quite a while then. We had co-located servers, right? So a customer would pay us to have a server on our network. And a lot of times they would pay us to like actually build the thing too, so I would build them a FreeBSD box or a Linux box or whatever, but we didn't manage them. And so these boxes would again just sit there and not getting patches or anything, right? And so, we had a number of customers who had like security incidents, where, I would end up being the one who had to clean up afterwards, and reinstall the OS or whatever.
I feel like that has gone in waves throughout the entire like history of the internet and people having services and whatnot. Because I was like, early days, it was just like Linux and Windows boxes directly on the internet with no firewalls, no security around them. And you could literally like see $ someone else's computer like in your ISP. Like my neighbors, like file systems were just exposed to whoever else was on the network of the ISP. And then it went through waves of like WordPress and things that were like hosted services that like, oh, you were kind of responsible for this. It was your responsibility to do something, but no one knew how to. And I feel like we've gone full circle again with things like Mastodon and like, hey, I want to run this as a server and this is my data. And it's like, yeah, you're responsible. Like there's this whole thing that people forget.
That's because developers like all of a sudden, like it's my little brother is building his own computer and like him and like my kids are building their own Raspberry Pi and then their friends are building like their own like Linux computers on like crappy old computers they found. And it's so funny, like people are obsessed with having options. And I'm like, there's a reason why we got rid of like and got things to be managed for us and more automated, because it sucks having to think about all those options. But it's like every like wave of like wanting to be able to touch all the buttons and people get so into it and you're like, dude.
Well, there's definitely excitement in building and learning new things.
Yeah.
And the maintenance side of it is not one of those usually exciting parts.
So when I worked at that ISP, I had my own server on the network. That was one of the things my boss let me do, and there were no restrictions on my bandwidth or anything like that. And, one of the things I did on that server was email, and it's just so funny because like nowadays I would never want to own a mail server. I've been paying people to do that for me for so many years now, but back then I just loved it, and
so you're at this ISP for a little while, you're learning a bunch of stuff. And at what point did you move over to WebMD?
that was like about 98. So I learned my first big lesson in like grown up pants, big boy business stuff, which was get everything in writing.
Oh no.
So our boss had been telling us at the ISP for years that like, he'd been telling me, cause I was a really key employee there. I was like the sysadmin, right?
Yeah.
And he'd been telling me for a long time that, oh, someday I'm going to sell the company and I'll make sure that you get something, you're going to get enough money to like buy a house or something like that. And he sold the company and I got offered twice as many stock options in the new company as a new employee would have, right? So like a new employee would have got 1,000 options. I was offered 2,000 with no vesting at all. Like the clock would start that day. And I was just like, you've got to be kidding me. I've been working at this place for 3 years and done so much, So I started looking for other opportunities and I happened to meet like one of the best recruiters that I've ever worked with, like in my career. She was a third-party recruiter and she was just fantastic. And she was like, what do you want to do? And that's not a conversation that recruiters have all the time, really. Like what exactly are you interested in? What kind of companies do you want to work at? And she ended up getting me an in there at WebMD. And I was really excited to work there. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people still know about WebMD. Like they still go there and like Google like whatever ache or pain they have that day. But for frame of reference, it's kind of hard to understand now. But like that company was so big then. They were taking out Super Bowl ads. There were people who described WebMD as being like potentially being the Microsoft of healthcare. And the reason why is it wasn't just the consumer stuff. It wasn't just the website. They were going to work with physicians. There was a different site that physicians could use, and like they could have their patients contact them. It was basically going to be like MyChart is nowadays, if you've ever used that. But that, of course, didn't take off at that point in time.
It was really early to digitize that information, right?
Yeah.
Like that was still like late 90s was like, what does the security internet look like? Like when was Dan Cohen had the first like purchase, like credit card purchase on the internet was like around that time?
That would have still been when I was at the ISP, because even there we were dealing with, it's kind of funny when the whole cryptocurrency stuff happened, because in like probably like 97 or something, we were dealing with this thing called cyber cash that was like one of the early, encrypted currencies. And I was big on, there was this email list called the Cypherpunks email list that was like the crypto nerds, and I was very big into that stuff. I would go to like PGP key signing parties and stuff. And so it was funny, like when the cryptocurrency stuff came up and everybody was like, this is brand new. And I was like, no, it isn't.
Rich is like, you're not old enough. This is
yeah. I mean, the thing that was brand new was the blockchain part. But yeah, so I go to WebMD. Like I said, it's the super big company. I come in as like, even though I have a few years experience, I'm still like sort of a juniorish sysadmin, like maybe mid-level at best. And it was a Solaris shop. So that was brand new to me. So I had done all Linux stuff up until that point. And we did have some Linux servers, but it was mostly Solaris. And that's a whole different world, right? We would have these big Sun boxes that had like 10 CPUs, and every CPU was like a whole shelf. You could pull them out and hot swap them. And yeah, it was, I didn't touch any of that stuff. They wouldn't let me touch those big boxes. But yeah. And when I started off there, I was doing a bunch of different things, sticking CDs in Sun boxes and building them. I ended up building like a little kind of cluster of Linux boxes that we use for like load testing, that would just run the load testing apps. But then eventually I got into doing deployments. They just had me do one or two on the physician site, which wasn't used as much. And then I ended up like doing it on the WebMD.com site. And that was kind of crazy because that was such a high traffic site. And so like doing a deployment was like a big deal, right? And when we would do a big release, we did them in the evenings and like everybody would come in, right? And we'd all be like sitting at our desks at like, 9 p.m. like doing this big deployment.
Right, because you had a maintenance window, right? And like did you take down the site, or like can we put up a splash page that points somewhere else? Or
no, we didn't have to take things down.
You just did it live.
Yeah, we would do kind of a rolling thing. So it's funny because, and I've talked about this some, I have a talk that I do where I mentioned this. People nowadays, they think of a website like that and they think of like tons and tons of hosts, or containers or whatever, that are taking traffic. We had 3 Sun boxes that were in the farm for that site. They were all in one load balancer farm. And the deployments at that point were, running some shell scripts. And I would literally take one of the 3 boxes out of service and run the shell scripts on it and then move on to the next one and roll through them that way. Yeah, it was a fun place to be at. Like there were a lot of really smart people there. One of the guys on the team, one of the kind of senior engineer, well, we were kind of like a Java shop, right? Not kind of, we were a Java shop. It was
Solaris and Java. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the guys there, the senior guy, had actually been on the Java team at Sun. And so he knew tons of stuff about Java, but also we had kind of like, an in with Sun, so like sometimes we would like report stuff to them that would get patched and things like that. But the craziest part of that was that we had our own web server that was written in Java. So the guys there had written the web server that we used.
We just had Mandy from AOL on a couple episodes ago, and like the AOL had their own web server, which is now open source, which is awesome too. Like these early days, like that's what you had to do, right? Because there was no generic, this is going to serve, generic traffic behind the scenes. And Apache came out, and as that expanded into having all these like other plugins and modules, it got a little complex. So like these like single purpose sort of web servers seemed like they were prolific. They weren't shared, but like they probably like people just like, it wasn't even open source at the time, right? Like the open source in the late 90s wasn't like a big thing. There wasn't a place to find all this stuff. So like your bug reports to Solaris and stuff is like, here's an email with this patch diff on a memory dump or something.
Right, exactly.
People weren't really using GitHub in the 90s, right?
Was no
GitHub
such thing.
even a thing?
Oh, yeah.
No.
Yeah,
That's
no.
crazy.
Like this wasn't even like SourceForge wasn't available at that point yet, right? Because
When did GitHub get like really like popular, I guess, like with like using and sharing open source? I'm trying to think.
I can't remember.
Also, another thing that's cool is like, you know, like WebMD and like Yahoo and AOL were such a big thing in the 90s. And it's crazy to see like how these giant companies are like, I mean, they still exist, but they're not what they used to be, you know? And then you wonder like what's going to happen like with the companies that are so huge right now that seem like they could never fail or never be like lesser than they are. It's amazing.
Yeah. I think it's kind of different now with some of these companies. They're so entrenched, you know, something like Facebook or Meta, excuse me. I still can't call it Meta. But
it's like when people call Twitter X and I'm like, I can't do it. Like, like
definitely
Twitter
can't do that
forever.
Yeah.
Git came out in 2005. GitHub was 2008. So I mean, you're like, this is like we're using like CVS. Like, what was that deployment script doing? Was it just like
CVS?
CVS.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with it, CVS was like one of the early version control systems. There was a thing called RCS before that. And yeah, the big difference between CVS and Git is that when you make a branch in CVS, it literally makes a copy of all the files. So it's not like Git where it just knows the differences between branches. You know, if you have a really big repo and you made a branch with CVS, it was like, go to lunch, you know, go take a 2-hour lunch or something because it's got to copy all the files over.
The merge conflicts that must have happened.
Yeah.
But like the fact that you were using version control at that time
That's
was
pretty
also
cool.
very surprising. Like, because that was not common for a lot of shops. Like this was like, here's a directory. We all either SSH to the server or, you know, SCP these files around. And that's how you manage source code back then.
I mean, I think that we did SCP the files around for the deployments, but those were like the tarballs or whatever. We did have a build process.
The artifact of whatever the release was.
Exactly.
Is like SCP'd.
Yeah, no, I think that for the time it was a pretty advanced shop. So the office that I was in here in Portland had been a startup that WebMD acquired.
Oh.
And so, you know, a lot of sharp people there, and, you know, they made all the technology that the website like ran on. And when I showed up already, this stuff was in play where Microsoft had invested a bunch in the company. I can't even remember the number, but it was huge. And they got a seat on the board for that. And the deal was that the company was supposed to move over to use Microsoft for all the stuff, like running the website and things like that. And for anyone who lived through that time period, you will probably be chuckling pretty hard at that idea, because doing web surfing with Windows, it was just a nightmare back then.
IIS came out, was that with 2000 server or?
No, it was before that, because again, we were using IIS even at the ISP that I was at, but it was, you know, that running on NT4. I have a funny IIS story. So when I was at the ISP, there was this team at Microsoft that was created specifically to market to ISPs. And so they wanted ISPs to like make an install disk that had Internet Explorer on it and all that stuff, right? And so they were saying, oh, you've got to get this new version of IIS. It's got this new stuff in it. And my boss got really excited about it. And so, you know, I was going to upgrade our IIS box and our one.
Yeah, the one box.
Microsoft Web Server. And I go and I run the upgrade thing on it. And we did declare like a maintenance window for that. And so I run the upgrade on it. And at one point it does the thing where it checks for disk space. And it's like, oh yeah, you've got enough disk space. And then it runs for like, you know, a couple of hours and it gives up and says, you don't have enough disk space. And it turned out it was, when it was doing the check, it was literally just saying, do you have enough room on the file system for the files? But IIS had this like internal database that kept the state of everything. And that database itself had to get migrated, and there wasn't enough room to like do the migration. And so it crapped out. and I had to go to tape, and restore everything from tape. By the end of the day, I'd worked on this for like 10 hours straight, and I was just completely fried. And I get home, and my girlfriend at the time, we'd lived together for a couple of years. She wanted to have the relationship talk.
Jeez.
Oh no, not after all that. Oh no.
And I was like, I just can't do this. I can't do this right now.
Let me tell you about IIS. Okay.
Yeah. Let's talk tomorrow or whatever. She went and stayed with her parents for the first time that night. Like, she had never been like, I'm going to my parents. And she dumped me the next day. So
no, I feel like that's one
Rich
of those
never
like,
ran IIS again.
like those are like one of those like just unfortunate like kind of like things that line up. Poor Rich.
I mean, obviously there were things that led up to that, right? Like, I can't blame it completely on IIS. But yeah, so that's my story about how Bill Gates ruined my relationship.
Which is funny because like that story is like played out again and again, right? Like especially Microsoft, a lot of investment in OpenAI, and guess where OpenAI runs? Azure. And like those, like that play has been pretty common in the industry of like, hey, we're gonna give you some money to do stuff with our products and promote our stuff.
Yeah, there may have been money involved too. Like, I never heard about that part of it, but it's very likely that marketing team was offering people money. So I'm at WebMD. And they have, there's this push to get everything onto the Microsoft stuff. And we were all just laughing, right? Because we just knew that it was just going to be brutal. There was a whole separate team, down in Santa Clara or somewhere that was like working on, getting everything up and running on Windows. And I was there for, I want to say 2.5 years, and they didn't get it done during that time period. And one of my friends told me later on that they finally got it migrated, like maybe like 2 or 3 years after I had left. So it was just ridiculous, like a crazy idea back then. Funny enough, I've heard a story, and I can't say if this is true or not, but when Elon Musk got kicked out of PayPal, so he had his own company, which was called X.
Yep, he held the domain.
And got bought, or merged with another company, and then they called it PayPal, right? And so he eventually gets ousted as the CEO, and Peter Thiel was involved, and there was a bunch of politics and stuff like that. But apparently, one of the factors is that Elon wanted to move everything over to Windows, which was that same time period. And it was just again a ridiculous decision. So whenever, even before the Twitter stuff, when I would hear people talk about how smart Elon was, I would just think back to that. But yeah, so I was there for like 2.5 years, and it was fun. It was a really great environment. A lot of really smart people, like I said, really fun people on my team. We would do stuff like, ping flood each other and like screw around, like, change people's desktops to like be something stupid and things like that. It was a fun time. And then, the company was actually kind of on the front end of the bubble bursting. Like I said, there had been this merger right before I showed up, with this other company. And we didn't know it at the time. They definitely didn't tell us, but it was less of a merger than an acquisition. Like, WebMD was just in trouble, financially. They just spent too much money, and the physician thing hadn't panned out, like I said. And we merged with this other company, and there were co-CEOs for a little while, and then
that's how you know it's a great merger.
Yeah,
no good can come from that.
Yeah, and then eventually the WebMD CEO went away. This guy named Jeff Arnold, and he started a company after that was like, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like you would get a soft drink like at McDonald's or somewhere, and the top, that went on the cup had like a disc in it, like a little music disc that you could pull out and play.
What?
That was
like
was
the lid
company.
had like a
yep,
like one of those like mini CDs in it.
Yep. So that was his big idea after WebMD.
But why?
It's an excellent question, Autumn. It's an excellent question.
Some of the like startups that you hear, I'm like, somebody funded this? Like,
I'm sure it had some really goofy name too. I can't remember what it was. The other funny story about Jeff Arnold is that, so the company was based in Atlanta. He owned a mansion that for a while, it had been described to me as being the mansion from Gone with the Wind. And I later on, like, I don't think that was true, but it was like, it was basically that mansion, right? It was very much like it. And at one point after he was ousted, I think, and like when, you know, things were kind of rocky with the company, his mansion burned down.
Jeez.
And people were like, huh, that's kind of coincidental that like suddenly a bunch of your money went away and the mansion burned down.
Wow.
Rich, you have the best tea for WebMD.
I'm sure that was accidental.
Accidental.
Any rumors about arson definitely are not true.
Okay, wait, I have to ask like a total petty tech Twitter like question. When you saw the video for WebMD when they were trying to force everyone back into office, did like a part of you like die on the inside? Because like I think we all cringed so hard.
I'm not actually sure if I even saw that.
Oh my God, Rich, you have to go watch. It is so bad. Like,
was this like a video they made for the employees?
yes.
Did it accidentally get published?
Yes.
Yeah, like they published it publicly on YouTube or something by accident. And
I don't know if they published it on accident or what, but I want to hope that it was on accident because I want to hope nobody saw that video and said, let's show the world this. Because if they did, like, I have questions. Like,
it was very cringe, executive out of touch.
I need you to find that video, like, ASAP. Like,
I'll have to watch it for sure. Yeah. It's kind of funny. So at one point, like this was years after I had worked there, they did open up another office like here in Portland. And this was after they were on the Microsoft stuff and everything, you know, probably like mid 2000s. And
so they actually got all the way on and migrated it?
Yeah. So they did open up another office here. And at one point, somebody like there was a job there when I was looking for work and somebody was like, you should go work at WebMD. And I was like, nope.
Sorry, no.
You're like hard pass.
Yeah. So we were, you know, like I said, we were kind of on the front edge of the bubble bursting, right? So because we'd had this bad merger and everything, you know, the company wasn't doing well. Part of the merger process, for anyone who's ever not been through it, is that usually one of the first things they do is like they do the efficiency studies and everything, and then they decide like which offices they're going to close, right? So there was a legendary website back then that was called a company. So it's like,
can we bring that back? Someone buy the like URL for this. Like, so.
I think somebody owns it. I think the guy who started it up still. The site isn't there anymore, but I think that he still has the domain.
We need a petition to bring this back because this is great.
And it was basically, you know, tea about companies that were in trouble, right? Startups that were in trouble. This was before the bubble burst, you know, and
I feel like tech needs this website like right now. Like,
I agree completely. It would have been very valuable in the last year or two.
Yes.
And people would do stuff like they would leak, you know, like internal like memos and emails about like which companies were laying off people and like what terrible things they'd done. So yeah, so there was, you know, things were already crazy back then, you know, and one of my favorite companies in that period was this company called Cosmo. It was Kozmo. It was basically like DoorDash or something, but they had actual employees. So it wasn't random people, right? Like they had employees that they paid and, you know, who I'm assuming got benefits and all of that. And they would deliver your lunch to your desk or whatever, right? And so they were another company that went under because apparently that business model did not pan out.
What's something you learned from those days running that infrastructure, trying to do things at that scale at the time that you kind of keep with you today whenever you're kind of evaluating technology or just running systems?
What did I learn?
Like there was a lot of smart people, there was a lot of stuff going on, and you're kind of at the forefront of a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, one of the big things back then was scaling, right? You know, and especially running at the kind of traffic that we got. You know, I don't even remember how many requests it was a day, but it was in the millions, you know. And so back then the scaling was all vertical, right? So like I said, we had these giant sun boxes and like there were 3 of them and that's how you scaled. And then, you know, probably in that period in like the late 90s, you know, was when the horizontal scaling started taking off more. And that was we had actually told like the WebMD people, the higher ups there, that instead of doing the Microsoft thing, that what they should be moving to is, a fleet of Linux boxes. But yeah, I think that, the importance of the scaling and the load balancing and all of that stuff was probably like the biggest thing that I took away from that.
It was funny seeing when I was starting as a sysadmin and like config management was coming out, and I saw all these companies that had moved to Windows stacks, like OpenTable was notable one, and WebMD, and like there was no config management for Windows ever. And so it's like they were still in this like, oh, we have to do these golden images with like some bat scripts, right? Like that was like as much as you could do. And then it was a lot of manual work, a lot of clicking, because PowerShell wasn't a thing, and they didn't have, APIs or command line scripting to do that stuff. So it was like, yeah.
It's crazy that there was no PowerShell.
Oh yeah, that was many years before PowerShell. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of, oh my God, what was the thing that preceded like Puppet and Chef and that stuff?
CF Engine.
Yes, CF Engine.
Yep.
So I actually played around with that some when I was at the ISP that I was at, and ended up just having some hard-coded config files like the host file and things like that I would use CF Engine to like deploy out to like.
No reliable DNS, right? Like the host files is where you lived if you wanted to do that stuff reliably. And I so many years I did not work in a shop that had a reliable DNS infrastructure, and so it was just host file management.
That's a super funny point, but totally true. Like you didn't want to rely on the DNS. Like,
and most of the time it was because it was a Active Directory DNS server that never worked for me. But even if it wasn't that, if it was like a bind server or something, you're like, when that has maintenance, everything else breaks, and I need to have some reliable way of replicating what's in bind and storing it locally so I know what IP address I'm going to hit. And that was like the longest time. And even today, I mean, like we're kind of doing it today with Kubernetes, right? Like IP addresses for like the Kube DNS, like the Kube API is like hard coded in there. It's just like, you don't want to rely on this discovery system. At some point, you just want the actual like ARP table to say like, hey, who on the network has this MAC address? Let me go there. And that's what you do.
Yeah, there's something else too. Like we were talking earlier about the early days of Linux and stuff like that. And like one of the things that's a pattern that's repeated itself a lot in the industry is that, or in technology in general, is that things start off open, So like the early versions of Unix like had basically no security at all. You could just like do all kinds of crazy stuff. And then, and like I said, even with like those early versions of Linux, there was no shadow passwords or anything like that. And so I think that things tend to start out open, and then as a response to the stuff that the hackers do, they get locked down more and more.
Well, it's hard, right? Like that security side of it is very difficult, and it adds more barriers, right? Because like managing password files that weren't with a shadow file and weren't hashed was a lot easier as a sysadmin. Because I'm like, hey, I'm gonna go change your password. Cool. VI Etsy password. And like, there you go, your password changed. Like that was the process. And like that changed a lot when you're like, oh, I got to run this password command. How do I do that? Look at the man page to do it for a different user. Do I switch it? All that stuff became more difficult. And at first it's funny because I thought you were going to say things started more open, and then IBM buys them, right? Because they like go close. Oh, sorry. That was a bad joke. And then,
wow.
Oh no.
Too soon. Too soon.
The wounds haven't even healed yet, Justin.
That's where I thought you were going, but
I did actually have a thought when I saw that news. Like I was wondering, I wonder if that process was already like in flight back when the licensing changes happened.
Instead of sips tea, we're going to say Justin sips Dr. Pepper after he says shady.
Well, Justin, when you were talking about that, about the password files and everything, that there was a book that I read back then. This one thing has stuck with me forever. This guy named Wietse Venema, who's the guy who wrote Postfix, which is a very popular
mail server,
SMTP server. Those times were funny back when that came out because there was another rival one and they were feuding a lot.
No one remembers the mail server wars.
No, there were some serious mail server wars. But he wrote this book called Practical Unix Security or Practical Internet Security, I think it was called. The title changed at one point, but he had the metaphor that he used was like a seesaw. And on the two ends of the seesaw were, on one side, it was security, and on the other side, it was convenience, right? And so it's like, those are the two ends of the spectrum, right? So something could be the most secure thing is shut all the computers down, right?
Unplug them from the network and you physically drive somewhere to go do something.
But then, it's, incredibly hard to use, and if things are completely open, then it's incredibly easy to use, and so that's a concept that stuck with me for a long time, is that, it's always kind of trying to balance those things, like how secure can we make something without like completely like screwing up the experience for users and their productivity.
And the fact that like just the threat model has changed drastically from the early 90s when, the elite few that could afford either a second line, phone line or a modem or whatever, like they were the ones on the internet. And now like you plug anything in that doesn't have a firewall that's on the public internet, like you are getting scanned in seconds. Like it's just like,
I just like wonder if like being a hacker in the 90s was more fun because like everything was like open, but then it was probably harder because you needed more tools to do that. And now
I don't think it was harder at all. There were script kiddies back then, and even when I worked at the ISP, I used to hang out on IRC and like these hacker channels and stuff and try to learn about that stuff and what people were doing.
I feel like it had to be way more fun in the 90s because like everything was probably open and there wasn't as much investment.
Yeah, I mean, I would have done things that would have been considered hacking at the time because I just learned about it, right? The hard part for me in the late 90s or 2000s was like just finding the information.
Yeah.
Like information was so scarce. Even like things were open, but you had no idea how it worked or what you were doing. And I'm like, when I popped up someone's $C sign, I'm like, what does this mean? What am I looking at here? I'm like, that's their files. Like, how did this work? Yeah. And like understanding how you get to that point and that thing actually exists. And now like all the docs are open and all of these things know how this stuff, and the information side of it is really, really free, but like you have to go really deep to find the like underlying thing that you still get around.
Yeah. Now there's like so many more automated protections and, best practices.
There's a lot of better defaults, for sure, right? Like there's just like things come. You don't get computers without firewalls anymore, like by default, unless you're doing it on purpose.
I think the way that you've had such a perspective, Rich, with like the fact that WebMD was kind of like around when there was that bubble. Like, how do you feel now that you've gone through seeing like these huge companies like kind of come and go, and also like seeing that first tech bubble? Like, how does that? Do you have any advice for people like the rest of like me and other people who this is your first time seeing this sort of a tech bubble and like recession or whatever you want to call it in tech? Like, how do you look at it?
I have to say, I think things are really rough right now. I exited my last job in like mid-November, and I intentionally took like a couple months off, but I've been looking for probably like 2 or 3 months now. And it's really hard. There aren't that many openings. I mean, I think that the thing that over the last few years in general has kind of helped me a lot is that I have that perspective of what it was like back then when the bubble did burst. So I didn't talk about this part, but, like I said, there was that merger, that WebMD had, and they were like looking to close offices. And at one point they decided they were going to close our office, right? And things were still pretty good at that point. And so they paid us a retention bonus, which is something that I don't know even happens nowadays, but they basically gave us double pay for like our last 3 months. Like they paid us, plus at the end of it, you would get another 3 months worth of pay as a bonus if you stuck it out till the end and helped like spin things down and migrate your tasks over to other people. And so we were in the middle of that period, and they were also laying off people from our team in Atlanta. And so at one point, this new VP comes in above us, and he realizes that basically all of the people who run the production website are about to get laid off at once. And so at that point, they actually tried to hire us back. So they were like, hey, we'll let you stay and you can keep the retention bonus. And I think pretty much all of us were like, nope, that's okay. Because things were so, I mean, back then I just felt bulletproof. I felt like I could find another job in like 10 minutes, Mm-hmm. And so I took some time off, after that. I took like a couple months off and just chilled. And then by the time I started looking for work, it had completely changed. And at that point, the only people that were hiring were the people like here in town were the people like Xerox, and they needed you to have a bunch of experience with these enterprise like Unix tools that I hadn't worked with before, a lot of IBM stuff. And yeah, it was really rough. And at that point, I ended up being unemployed for 10 months. And I was at the point where I wasn't going to make rent in a few weeks. And so I ended up taking a job that was like a 40% pay cut. And it was much worse responsibilities, right? Like compared to the kind of stuff that I'd been doing. And it was rough, but I did what I had to, and I sucked it up and I worked there for a while. And then I finally ended up getting another job, that kind of put me back more like where I was. One of my friends from WebMD actually went to another company and ended up getting me hired there. But I mean, I think that the biggest lesson that I've had from all of that is that, like, I know things are scary right now for a lot of people, but this stuff really does go in cycles. Do what you need to take care of yourself now, like make the best decisions that you can and, try to keep the faith that things are going to get better, right?
Do you think this is just part of tech where we'll just continue to go through these cycles? Like, is this just part of like the territory, I guess?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, one of the things that's contributed a lot to this stuff over like the last few years is the fact that a lot of the investment is going into places that just really don't make sense, right? Like the amount of investment that went into blockchain stuff, like every VC was like throwing money at these blockchain startups. And a lot of us just knew, right, that they were just throwing money down a hole, right? And that stuff was never going to work out. I mean, I can think of maybe a handful of like legitimate use cases for it where having like a public ledger that's only writable, makes sense.
Yeah.
But there's so few, and everything was like, I'm going to take this thing I'm already doing and rub a little blockchain on it. And suddenly I can get some money from venture capitalists. And
well, don't worry. They've said replaced all the blockchain with AI. So we're fine now.
Like the amount of money that they've spent, like I just like the last couple conference I've gone to and you just walk around the floor and it's the same startup with a different logo over and over. And you're just like, this is not sustainable. Like there's no way.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. And it's, there's two things. There's the companies that are the new startups that are like, their whole identity is we're an AI company, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the companies that were already around that are like, oh, now we've got to have some sort of AI offering, right? We've got to add AI into our tool, even though it makes absolutely no sense to do that.
It's just wild after like crypto and NFTs and like
You would think
blockchain and
people
like
learned their lesson.
But it's like they went even harder for AI. I'm just like, and then they put it in everything, and I'm like, like the security problems we're gonna have, like I'm just like, oh goodness. Like
looking back on like when I first saw blockchain, like I read the white paper from Satoshi like a long time ago. I like was doing Bitcoin from the early like 2009 or something like that. Like I had Bitcoin. I was like, this is fascinating. And I saw like the shift of like everyone jumped in for the money side of it. I'm like, no, I was like, I wanted the tech side. Like, how did that work?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And I got out of it. I'm like, I'm done. But like my first experience with like, oh, cool, I mined some coin versus my first interaction with like ChatGPT were completely different of like how my experience was. And so I understand the like hype cycle of like, oh, like this is just a money thing versus like, oh, this had a conversation with me. Like those are different like mindsets of people that are attracted to them. So like,
see, I feel like I had the interest in the other way. Like I looked at blockchain and I was like, it's an immutable data structure that like, you know what I mean? Like I was just like, I don't get it. Like,
it's a slow database.
Yeah, like NFTs were like a bad DNS receipt for a lot of money. Like
exactly. Here's an HTTP link to a JPEG.
Websites never go away.
But like AI, like that was something I legitimately before the hype cycle wanted to like learn more about the ethics, and I feel like it could really like change the way we do things. But like it's so odd to see, like I feel like we've scaled back on so many like AI like I guess services or offerings or startups that could have actually been different, and we put so much money into generative AI, which is like, dude, we've had chatbots and Ask Jeeves and like, you know what I mean? Like it's just odd even where we're choosing to put like this huge, like they've closed so many other realms of like machine learning and AI and like different projects to see like this huge race where everyone's doing the exact same thing, and now you like are treating developers like crap. And I'm just like, but who's going to build it? Who's going to like maintain it? Like, what are we doing? Like, I'm so confused. Like, this doesn't even make sense. Like, we just did this and it was like worse. And then you're like, let's go even harder for a horrible, like, I don't get it.
Yeah. So working in operations, for many years, I was concerned with things like monitoring, And 8-10 years ago, there was these companies that were adding like, oh, we got machine learning now in our monitoring software, and it's going to do anomaly detection, and you're going to get less false positives. You're going to get woken up less at 3 a.m. And it just even all felt like snake oil back then, and it doesn't seem like things are much different. It's just like the size of the data sets, right? Like I'm not an expert on this stuff at all. Like I'm very far from that, but it's like, I know there are more complex models and things too, but I mean, it still feels to me a lot like Mad Libs, it feels to me like it's just like, it's like the predictive text on your iPhone when you're like writing something, and
which is AI driven, right? This is
And it's still so weird that like they can't just, and I obviously do not know a ton about like hallucinations and stuff, but I feel like we could solve a lot of the problems with it just saying I don't know instead of making something like that's the scary part, when it completely makes something up and you're just like
yeah, I mean, it wants to give you an answer, right?
Yeah.
And like if it can't find the real data, it's just gonna there's those stories about the lawyers, who it's happened at least a couple times. Like some lawyer like had ChatGPT write a brief for him, and he goes up in front of the judge, and it's like full of cases that aren't real even.
Well, not just that, but it's wild. Like we can't decide what goes in our kids' textbooks. Like people literally can't. Like there's people who will sit there and be like, that huge thing in history where like didn't happen. We don't know what you're like. So how are we going to sit here and agree what we're going to put into Chat GPT? Like it only goes back to 2022 or something like that. So can you imagine like just that fight in general of what is the source of truth that we're putting in here is going to be wild.
Yeah, and I mean we know that these data models tend to be, racist and misogynist.
That's what I'm saying. And then if they only put in search, like I'm just like, oh, this is going to go wrong in so many ways.
Yeah, like Google firing all their AI ethics people. I mean, not all of them, but like some really important AI ethics people was a pretty big sign as to where things are heading.
Well, the G in GPT stands for gullible. So that's...
I was sitting in a talk at a conference that we will not name, and they were talking about how like their AI was going to do all these, like it was going to stop like all of these like cyber attacks, and it was going to make DOS like attacks like not happen, and it was going to do all these amazing things. And then someone behind me was like, we're using it and we're getting a ton of false positives. And she just like murdered his whole like spill. And I was like, I wonder if this is basically our future for a while.
Well, this has been a roller coaster of positivity on what the internet's going to look like in the next few years. But Rich, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about what things were like back in the day and kind of how you're seeing things repeat over time. And just FYI, like I know you are looking for work, and I looked up WebMD is hiring tech leads.
Oh wow!
Did you see that video? Why would you do that to Rich? He's our friend now. Why would you
in
do
Mumbai,
that?
So you'd have to relocate. But yeah.
All right, I'm interested.
Yeah. Well, I'll send you the link.
Justin and the dad jokes, like just it should be like a whole like part of the show, like the one Justin like dad joke an episode.
Well,
like
you need to make a super cut of them.
I know
all the terrible jokes. Thanks you so much, Rich, and we'll talk. Oh, actually, if people want to reach out to you or find you online, where should they go?
Oh yeah. I mean, probably the best two places at this point, because Twitter, and we'll call it Twitter, is such a dumpster fire. I mean, I'm on there. I check it occasionally.
I know. It makes me sad because it was like so amazing. And then I go there and it's literally just a bunch of like tech bros talking crap to every woman in tech. And then like Elon.
It doesn't even load on most of my devices anymore. I don't care.
It's like you just walk in and like it's familiar and you recognize it, but you're like, this is not the same place. Yeah. What just happened?
But yeah, I'm Rich Burrows there, with no dots or anything. I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm richburrows.dev there. So that's probably a better place if you want to just like get more like my casual tweets. And then the funny part about it is I think the whole Twitter thing has led to like a resurgence in LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn is really like one of the best places now to stay in touch with people and post content and things. And so if you search for my name there on LinkedIn, or it's just linkedin.com/in/Rich Burrows, is me. So, feel free to like follow me there or connect if we know each other.
That's crazy. I feel like I've gotten more engagement on LinkedIn. It's weird because like I feel like tech social media has like dispersed into all these different corners, and I'm waiting to see where we all end up at some point.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This was really fun. It was good to see you again, Justin, and nice to chat with you too, Autumn.
It was nice to finally meet you almost in real life, virtually in real life. I don't know.
Thanks so much. Thank you again, Rich, for coming on the show and telling us how things used to work. And if anyone else has interesting stories from their past, we would love to hear from you. We love these retro episodes and learning just how things used to be. So feel free to email us at shipit@changelog.com and we can figure out if there's a way we could get you on the show and talk about it.
Also, someone hire Rick because he's amazing.
For today's outro, this is going to be just a kind of a little discussion about something that happened on the internet, which someone who has controversial opinions about some things posted. So DHH over at David Hannemeyer Hansen, if you don't know, posted about a blog post about we're moving continuous integration back to developer machines. And he was talking about this and saying, hey, this is his company's Hey. Actually, his company's Basecamp, but the product that he works on right now is Hey. They had CI systems. CI and CD are, if you don't know, continuous integration and continuous delivery. And continuous integration is specifically responsible for like running your tests in your builds and saying like, hey, how does this software work? And validating it, making sure that all of the tests you have pass. CD is all about pushing those bits out to the world to actually deliver them so that customers can use them. And in this case, he's arguing that the CI system that they were using, I don't even remember if he mentioned what it was slow. And it was slow to the point of annoying him or something. And I think in his tweets, he was saying it was taking like 10 minutes or something like that to run CI. And on his local machine, it would take like 2 minutes. I was like, okay. Yeah, like computers are fast. He's arguing that local computers are fast. The thing that I found interesting was that he replaced the CI system with this like 50-line bash script. And a lot of this to me screams of comments on places like Hacker News, where someone says, I could rebuild that in a weekend. And once you get to some level of proficiency with tools, in DHH's tool bag is probably Ruby and Bash.
Yes.
And you say like, I could replace that with a small bash script. And he did for some amount of his use cases. And I found it interesting. And Autumn, I would love to hear your opinion on CI/CD systems.
I have so many opinions.
Yeah, like because like this is something that he did that solved his problem.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of other problems that this creates, right? He has this sign-off bash script, which again is 50 lines. And all it does is it runs 5 different Ruby scripts. It's just like, hey, we're going to figure out what our Git repo is or our SHA is, and then run these scripts that do tests. And it's like, okay, if that's all you're doing for CI, where does that have to happen? And like, where do we make that repeatable? And a lot of that comes down to like, do we trust the developers? Because like, if I had this locally and one of them caused an error, I could just comment it out and run it again. And they're like, oh, cool, we passed, right? Like you could do these sorts of things, but you have to kind of trust the environment. You have to trust the company. You have to trust people you work with. And at large companies, I absolutely know that this would happen, that people would just say, I skipped those things because they were annoying.
I think that's just humans, but I don't even think that's the biggest point there. First, anything that comes out of that man's mouth is like, he speaks in absolutes, which I think we all know that when we say it depends, it's for a reason, right? Like it depends on what you're building. It depends on what kind of software. Like there's so many caveats that it drives me wild that he has such influence and he really influences people and he knows, he's aware of the influence he has and he just makes hot takes to be controversial and for people to bolster his like position or whatever it does for his ego or whatever. But I also just think that this sounds great, right? But isn't everything small that we run locally faster? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like almost like no shit. Like, but at the same time, like if you're building for multiple architectures and multiple versions of something, that's not going to work. It's like saying something built, like something works on my machine. Like
it tests on my machine.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this is, right? Like
just working in environments in the past where you're building for different architectures, you cannot test on one architecture and know for sure. Like think about how many kinds of Linux there are. Like you have Mac and Windows. There's so many different kinds of, and I just don't think that is great to speak of it in an absolute of, you can do this. And look, I reinvented the wheel and I made it so much better. And it's like, cool, you did for your use case, but you should, I think if you really wanted to teach and you don't just like the sound of your own voice, you'd say, I did this. And I did it because this was my use case. And then you give people information like a postmortem, or when you're doing a tutorial, or you give them the background. He's also said like, go on-prem because it's cheaper and cloud's dead. But like it is for some use cases, it is cheaper, and some it isn't. But he never gives the information to be educational. He gives the information to like get someone to retweet it.
Well, I mean, in that specific use case too, like he has like a follow-up post of like, here's our numbers, right? Like this is how much it cost us, and this is why we said it was cheaper.
He's constantly only giving certain information. Do you notice that? He is very selective. It's always to prove his point. And it's never like, there's tons of people who've done things with like obscure work, like not even obscure, but like every kind or type of like, if it's like a retail vertical or gas, a lot of things are reusable. And it's actually great when people share those and they're like, hey, I saved money doing this, and I'm all for it. But they'll be like, and I did this and those, reasons relate it to this, and this is how we got here. But he gives out very specific information, and it's almost just kind of to hype himself up in his opinion sometimes. And I'm just like, dude, you actually build cool stuff. Like you could really give out and help people and be a voice that we could all learn from. But it's like he is just, I don't know. It just seems like he only gives out very one-sided information. It's like when Elon said he was going to close the one data center, and he closed a whole data center. But what else did you open? Like, he's like, I deleted all this code, but how did you do that? You know what I mean? What's cool, teach us, but actually give us the information we need to make decisions based off of what you're promoting, I guess.
Yeah, well, and like for this specific like implementation of like a local CI, like there's like 20 things I thought of right away. Like, oh, well, you could improve this by running these things in containers, having reproduce. Because like if someone's on a Linux machine versus a Mac or versus Windows versus whatever, like how do you make this a little more reproducible? But then also I think that like I'm constantly running tests locally as I'm developing things, or we're writing some tests, we're verifying those tests. I'm not doing the whole suite because like that takes longer. Mm-hmm. But then I also like when I get push, like at that point I run the system, like the system runs again just because it's designed to run again. And whether that's saving time or not, or for some tests, that's going to save a lot of time. Like I've worked on plenty of systems where it was like half a day to build the software. And it's like, hey, like if that's the thing, like if I could speed up 20% of that, then that's a big win, depending on how it works. So we had a whole system for building software that would like distribute it amongst everyone else's developers' machines. It was like, hey, we could like distribute this in containers and make sure that it ran consistently, but it also reduced our overhead for how long it took to run. But it did take time to set up that environment and do this other stuff. So it's like wherever your bottleneck ends up being. And this specifically, it sounds like, hey, I have a really fast machine. I can just get rid of some of this bottleneck by just running it locally. I don't have to push it. And that does help with debuggability, right? It's like, I hate committing something and seeing Jenkins fail 20 minutes later and I don't get the notification, and that cycle really, really sucks.
Yeah.
But if it is reproducible enough locally, where should CI run? Because CI and CD have always been coupled just because historically Jenkins told you to, right? Like Senor Jenkins was like, hey, I can do both, just run them here.
I think they're all valuable though. Like even when you have automated CI/CD, there's sometimes when you can learn more by testing a portion of it locally when something fails, right? Like I think you can always have both in certain situations. Like something will fail and it doesn't make sense, and you go test it locally and it passes, and then you have to figure out why. But I just think that he didn't give enough information. Like there's certain use cases where maybe you only have to test it locally. Maybe you're building something that's very Mac specific and you're testing it on a Mac and it's only for that thing, but how much software is really that small? I don't know. Depends, I guess. It depends on what you're building.
I guess it depends on the target a lot of times, right? Because like, to your point, like if I was developing something on a Mac, I would build it on my Mac, I would test it on my Mac, and I would push it somewhere else, and I would like reproduce the Mac environment. And that's really, really hard.
Well, not just that, but think about it. There was a time where things worked on Macs, but when they came out with an M1 chip, they had to then start making patches for it to work on an M1 chip. So if that was the case and you had an M1 laptop, testing it locally would be the right thing, because you're testing it for that specific system to get it to run. But I think this just goes down to like, it depends. And I feel like you always should leave the world a better place than you found it. And when you have knowledge, especially right now, like people in tech are struggling, they want to find jobs. We've got like new people coming in, and like give them the background to learn from you. Like, dude, you've contributed to a whole language. You've got a whole company. Like, pass that knowledge down, play it forward, and don't just hype yourself up all the time.
Well, so what situations do we think that CI locally makes sense?
If you're doing a specific for the architecture that you're running it on patch for something that maybe has been tested everywhere else, but now you need it to work for that specific architecture, maybe,
and that's still difficult because it's like your environment is different than your customers.
Exactly. So I still think that you have to still run it through some sort of automation and have it test like on more than one machine. So that's what I'm saying. It just like, I always want to give the benefit of the doubt, because even when you may disagree with people in some areas, I think people, like everybody has like diverse, valuable perspectives, but this is just one of those, like, there's so many ways that this could be bad advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because like this isn't necessarily good advice for everyone to say like, oh, we should do CI locally because they're doing it. And I guess when it's homogenous at the developer experience, right? Like if everyone in my company was doing workspaces, like virtual workspace, like GitHub workspaces,
yeah,
right? Like those are virtual, they are reproducible, they are tightly controlled in what they install and how they work. And I could see that being a environment where local CI makes sense, because the environment where it's developed is tightly controlled enough that it's going to be consistent, and it's going to be the same as if I spin up another container and have Jenkins do the same steps, right? Like those sorts of, that makes sense to me, is if
maybe something that's a small tool, but I think at this point, especially like in open source and like at scale, it's probably not a great, it might be a great way to debug something or to double check something, but at any kind of scale that makes it worthwhile, I don't know what the use case would truly be where you could use this.
That was the other thing I was thinking. It's like when your development environment is tightly controlled and when your target system is tightly controlled, right? Because he's deploying in containers on a deployment system that he wrote, right? Like literally, like I forget what's called, Kamal, that's what's called. And so it's like, it's just Docker containers at the end of the day. So it's like, hey, if you can control one end and you can deploy in one specific area where, again, you can control the processor and the operating system or the container environment, all that stuff, that environment seems like, yes, I can see how you can come to this natural conclusion that you can save some time and do it this way. But if you don't control either ends of that spectrum, then this probably is going to cause more complexity in the verification and testing side of it, and the integration.
But even when you do control those things, eventually you're releasing software into the wild for people to run it in different places, and it could still end up with a problem depending on what the use case is.
Well, there's this software specifically isn't open source. Like they're not letting other people run this. This is the back end for hey.com. Like there's a web interface in the back end. And so it's like, that's their systems. Like who cares? That makes sense to me. It's like if I'm releasing it and say like, if I only ship a container, but even that like architecture and
that's what I'm saying. There's different architectures for like the doc. That's just an image, but what kind of image, like, so,
yeah, but that's where, like, if you can control both ends of that spectrum, you can simplify a lot of the middle.
But how much software do we really control both ends of that spectrum? I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. It does happen, but at scale, it is unlikely, for it to be like, I think you can do like intense test coverage and you still end up with edge cases that you have to go account for and do a fix for. So,
and a lot of that though is user behavior, right? A lot of those edge cases are not down to the system.
Sometimes it's not though. Sometimes like at this point, we are running very complicated infrastructures in a lot of places. Like just like phones are complicated, like just regular laptops are very complicated. People are like, so it's just, there's such a variety of different kinds of phones, different kinds of computers, and, just people are using MacBooks, but they're using it on a dev desktop. Like just who knows? Like I feel like there's just too many variables.
Yeah.
Which gets us back to the famous saying of it depends.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like what environments have I ever worked in where we controlled both ends of that spectrum.
I was thinking maybe if you're writing like an automated script somewhere and it's very, very, very basic, but for all the use cases in which this would apply, you're not doing intensive CI/CD pipelines and automation anyways, right? Like it's maybe be a part of that, but I don't know. I can't think of anything.
I was like, just want to figure out if there's a use case for it. If anyone has opinions and would like to talk to us, again, you can email us. But I think actually the changelog Slack would be a good place to. There's a Ship It channel.
I love the changelog Slack.
Yeah, feel free to jump in and talk about it because we'd be interested. I'd be interested in knowing like what other things are we missing if you don't control both ends. Would it make sense to do something like this? Because it's just a conversation around. I've done it in the past, and it was always seen as an anti-pattern. Right? Like before CI/CD was a thing, like that's just how things worked. But now it became an anti-pattern, and is that anti-pattern always also true?
I also think that there's so many great tools like GitHub Actions and different ways of testing that does so much for you that unless you're just trying to do a bug fix or you're just trying to bug something and, get like a kind of a quick way to do something locally before you then put it to something automation, like there's so many cool ways to do testing that you get more coverage for.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening to the show this week. Thank you again, Rich. And I forget what we have for next week. We have a couple things scheduled, but I don't know what order they're going in anymore.
Oh, yeah. I can't think of the order. I mean, I could just name a bunch of guests, but I don't know about the order.
So I'm sure we'll have someone great because we've had a string of great guests. And
I can't believe we get to talk to all these people on the podcast. It's like nerding out with like the coolest people.
It is definitely a life hack of being on a podcast and inviting cool people to come talk to you.
So much fun.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and we will talk to you again soon.
3, 2, 1.
Thanks for listening to Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Head to shipit.show for all the ways, or just search for Ship It wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find us. Thanks once again to our partners at fly.io, to the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder for these dope beats, and to Sentry. Use code CHANGELOG when you sign up and save $100 off their team plan. That's all for now, but come back next week when we continue discussing everything that happens after Git Push.